Our next speaker is probably well known to most people in the Kurdish community in UK. He was born and brought up in Iraqi Kurdistan. He finished his medical education in Baghdad and continued and successfully finished his medical education in UK. He is currently the professor of clinical microbiology and head of molecular biology and immunology group in Nottingham University. If I'm correct, he's probably the only Kurdish professor in medicine in this country. Apart from medicine, he has a long interest in human rights issues. He's a founder member of Kurdish Scientific and Medical Association, which is also co-organizer of today's event. He was the chairperson of that organization until 2 years ago. He also has a long interest in prevention of chemical and biological warfare. This is probably started when his parents and his siblings also became victims of chemical weapons in Iraqi Kurdistan in the late 1987. He also has a prolific academic career and has published extensively in many journals on chemical and biological weapons, Kurdish human rights, and other issues. You'll find out that he's an excellent speaker, and it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dlawer Ala'Aldeen.
Present my piece, and I consider ourselves in a way luckier than we've ever been before. Some years ago we used to be quite depressed about the issue of Halabja and Anfals, and every time we wanted to commemorate Halabja, we found ourselves without friends in high places, friends who could make a difference, whom we could lobby and whom we could ask for help and action. This is okay. Okay. Now, years later, we find ourselves that not only we have more friends and we have more quality people working for human rights and more well-spoken, articulate Kurds and second-generation Kurds who are engaged in the campaign for our human rights. But importantly, we have also seen transformation in the situation in Kurdistan, where we not only have lands now and people, but we have influence and we have governments. It's now the whole campaign is entering a new phase. The phase of simply remembering misery is gone. It's actually saying what we can do for the future generations and how we can actually hold perpetrators to account. The scene was beautifully said by the number of speakers before me. That helped my introduction. But I will be taking the argument just a little bit further to touch on issues that are really things that should make a difference. And these are practical points that it's our responsibility to carry on this campaign. I think Akshosh Haji and Gwyn Robert touched on some key issues that I want to take a little bit further. I have used the title of Lessons and Retribution. We should not forget that actually, when it comes to lessons, we have to include Kurdish politicians, in that for a long, long time they never learned until recently, because they used Halabja simply to further their causes, rather than to help Halabja people or to further the entire cause of the nation of Kurdistan. But we are very lucky that in the last year both major Kurdish parties in Iraqi Kurdistan, as well as elsewhere, have behaved very responsibly towards the federal issue of Kurdistan. We really now feel that we are making such a progress that they are representing our views in this negotiation with the Iraqis. But I can tell you in my presentation, I am going to say that this is not enough. This should be the foundation of future change and further work that has to be done. So you'll find that I'll be talking about mostly international community, not the Kurdish community. I will not be touching on the Kurdish side other than what I've just said. But importantly, I'm not going to talk about Saddam Hussein and Ali Hassan Majid. They are history now. As far as I'm concerned, I saw Saddam losing his sons in front of his eyes. He lived in a grave. He was buried alive for a long time. He was caught and brought back to custody in his own palace. For me, that does it. But it's actually the people who made him, the people who continue to make people like him, and the people who deny us our rights are the ones who matter. Ali Hassan Majid and Saddam are small players. It's the big players that I'm after. These people think George Bush and Tony Blair really consider the game over by capturing Saddam, whereas we are saying, A, don't be so pleased with yourselves, B, we cannot be fooled as Kurds, thinking that the whole scenario was by Saddam and now he's history. It's the establishment, it's the business world, it's the greed that made Saddam and continues to drive the Western agenda. So I'm going to concentrate on major questions of who made Saddam, who backed him, and who benefited from him. Okay? And importantly, I want to know exactly who should be paying for it and who should learn the lessons from it. The question of who made Saddam, who created Saddamism. Saddam is a product of the Cold War. Saddam is actually a very natural phenomenon in the Middle East. If you had put a Kurd in Baghdad during the Cold War, they would have been just as bad as Saddam, with no respect to human rights and no belief in democracy. So Saddam was a phenomenon of the Cold War era. He was like many, many other dictators who are doing exactly the same to their own people. Among them, there are Kurds who are, of course, suppressed by them. But if you look at a country of any of these, just remember what happened in the last 3-4 days. What the son of Hafez Assad did. Imagine if the Cold War had continued until now. We not only would have seen the son of Hafez Assad being the president, we would have seen the son of Saddam and the son of the King Hussein and the son of every one of these to be now president and continue to suppress minorities. I want to touch on the major issue that it is actually creating dictators like these who suppressed minorities, who felt so angry that they were powerless, they resorted to terrorism. We as Kurds are so lucky that we never resorted to terrorism despite our deep anger, deep sense of anger towards not only our suppressors, but the masters of our suppressors. No surprise that people in Palestine and elsewhere are linking their own suppressors with America. So terrorism was born out of this environment. It's this environment that has to go. Clearly, in that whole picture, the global picture, the Kurds were nowhere to be seen. Like many other minorities in most countries, they are nowhere to be seen, simply because the superpowers concentrated on controlling the central government of all these countries, Iran, Turkey, and minorities were nowhere in the picture. It's now the change of that game that made us significant. Okay? Otherwise, they're still at it. Imagine the United States, which we are considered by many, probably quite rightly, as one of the major allies in Iraq. We are now living in a honeymoon with the Americans. And it's the same administration that actually suppressed any attempt to disclose or to put any pressure on Saddam during Halabja time, during Anfal time, and thereafter, and before that. it was actually the State Department of America that blocked any action in the United Nations. They simply inhibited other nations to do anything. And it was all for one reason. It was all for greed, and it was all for the fact that Saddam continued to be good for business. And human rights issues were really not on their agenda in the first place. It was the same good man whom we all like, Rumsfeld, who has really been one of our best allies. It was at the time Rumsfeld, representing Ronald Reagan's government, who went to Iraq and shook hands with Saddam. The statement in blue is actually what the Pentagon believed. They said chemical weapon is just another way of killing people, just like a bullet. So what's the point in actually getting heat up about chemical weapons? Rumsfeld, when he went to Baghdad, actually discussed Bechtel's issues with Saddam. It's about a pipeline, oil pipeline, and Saddam didn't like it. And this is a government envoy discussing business, big business with Saddam on behalf of not just government, but business. Second trip to Baghdad, Rumsfeld actually represented George Shultz. Why? Because America started talking about chemical weapons and human rights, and secretly sent Rumsfeld to Saddam to say, don't worry, that is for public consumption. We talk about this in the media, but business is as usual with Iraq. I want to take you back to that. The reason I've underlined Shultz and Bechtel is just to tell you the CV of Shultz. Shultz at the moment is still on the board of Bechtel. Bechtel is a major international corporation. He was Secretary of State in America, and between his state jobs, he was on the board of Bechtel. And even now, he's on that board, and while on that board, he's also chairman of a committee that was pro-war against Saddam, which is, of course, fine by us. Bechtel is a very important player in this game. US aid, that's taxpayers' money, was donated, was given, not donated, was given to Bechtel to rebuild Iraq. Almost £1 billion of that. People in high places in the US government are still strongly connected to Bechtel. I want to demonstrate in this slide one fact. Do not separate between governments and business. So it's not just in Kurdistan, business and politics is the same. In America too. When you talk about American business, you talk about American ruling class. And the individuals who rule are the individuals who own America as well. Just as an example, I told you about Shultz. What about all those people who actually run CIA? Bechtel, the man himself, or the son of the original founder, is actually on a very powerful committee that George Bush asked him to chair. Caspar Weinberger, he was on that board of Bechtel. Natsios, and importantly, several CIA directors were on Bechtel board. Actually, Bechtel was also owned at some point, its shares were owned by Bin Laden. So Bin Laden, can I just ask you to move a little bit, Kashau? If you just move a little bit, you'll find that Bin Laden is right behind you. It's okay. That probably is the only picture in that board. It's a small world. Bin Laden, before he became terrorist, he was part of the gang. Saddam was part of the gang. They made these people, they created them. CIA made them, Bechtel made them, and now they're turning against them. Can I also remind you that, not many of you remember, I can't remember, but Mossadegh of Iran was actually ousted by CIA, and Bechtel played a role in that. Bechtel actually overthrew more than just Mossadegh, overthrew other governments too. So our lobby, not our fight, our struggle and our lobby is not just with politicians, but again against everyone who supported terrorism and human rights abuses. Now that was America. What about the United Kingdom? What about British role? David Miller, the Secretary of State, was in Baghdad during Halabja, and no one said a word. And actually Tony Newton went to Baghdad a week or so after Halabja and gave more money to Saddam to buy British arms than ever before. Very, very soon, Saddam and Iraq became the third country in the world with the biggest business with Britain. Okay? That is throughout the 80s, until Halabja and after, until Supergun was seized, and until there was sanction on Iraq. Okay? Fallujah 2 is a big plant, chemical weapon plant, was secretly built by the British. Even the Americans didn't know it was Britain that was building it for them. How many bombs were made in Fallujah 2 and dropped on the Kurds? Okay. And who made it? Who paid for it? Did the ministers in Britain know about Fallujah? Of course they did. Did they talk about it? Did they reveal it to the MPs? They didn't. I can tell you one thing that I am convinced about, and this is really when we campaign for Halabja, we should remember. It doesn't matter who is in Downing Street. Whether it's Winston Churchill, whether it's Margaret Thatcher, whether it's Tony Blair. These are faces of the establishment. It doesn't matter who's there. It's the policymakers and it's the administration that we really need to influence and change. Therefore, Tony Blair today wants to justify war on Iraq. He does it very beautifully. And he would have justified or defended or would have simply not acted during Halabja time if he'd been in power. Now, of course, he wasn't there. How do I know? But I'm convinced of that because it's the establishment and it's the business that we are really up against. This international complacency, these are just examples. Britain and US are the two we know well. But look at France, look at Germany, look at Russia, look at elsewhere. That complacency is what led to so many dictators in the world to own chemical weapons, biological weapons, and some of them nuclear weapons. All of these countries own these weapons, and vast majority of them are ruled by dictators who would not hesitate to use it, who would have minorities among them that are suppressed. Look at Chechnya in Russia. Look at India, look at even Pakistan, which is now nuclear. Every single one of these. These were products and consequences of the Cold War. Now the game is over. During the Cold War, people like Iraq, countries like Iraq, Gulf, and all these oil-rich countries used to buy arms because they could use those planes to bomb their enemies, to arm themselves to become super regional powers. But under the war on terror, this game has changed. You cannot use an airplane to kill terrorists. You can't pinpoint terrorists. Terrorists are here, are everywhere. This is bad for business. You cannot tempt a state, an oil-rich state, to buy your planes and your tanks because that doesn't work against terrorism. And more importantly, terrorism is now highest on the list of anti-business, even higher than communism. It is bad for business. You cannot get rid of it without actually spreading justice and democracy in a country, and you will have no justice without democracy. Now, this is what gives me optimism. This is what we have been talking about, that the name of the game will have changed. The only way to get rid of terrorism is not necessarily the way that George Bush and Tony Blair have adopted. It's to do with minorities like us. It's to do with people like us being given their just rights. The Cold War is over, and people like Saddam are actually now in the way. In the fight against terrorism, it doesn't help to have dictators ruling these countries, continuing to work like before, and you trying to make money, make business, and spread influence in these countries. People like Saddam are now actually, in the way of business, they have to go or they have to change. If they don't go, they have to change. And remember, every single one of them is dispensable. The whole world will run even better if they're not there. So for America to get rid of Saddam is easy simply because it's no longer like 10 years ago when they couldn't. So if you want to get rid of them, it's a decision that is required, not a reason. Tony Blair and George Bush were looking for reasons. Connecting Iraq to terrorism, this was actually not found. Saddam was not connected to bin Laden. If there was any connection, we knew it's indirect because Saddam himself was a terrorist. Weapon of mass destruction, again, nobody knew any more than we did. In fact, we knew more than they did. More importantly, the dossier that Tony Blair produced had a lot of quotations and extracts from not only that PhD student from Cambridge, but things that we in the community, Kurdish community, produced. A lot of the evidence were produced by Gwyn Roberts and his likes, and people who actually examined soil samples, and we produced the evidence and Tony Blair used this. Imagine, the MI6 and CIA had less information than we as Kurds had, and we had a stronger case, moral case for war than they had. Now he's in custody. Would you believe it that the decision to get rid of Saddam was actually decided long, long, long before the war, even before September the 11th? I know that George Bush and his team, they met for 4 hours when Bush was president-elect, i.e. before he became president by a month. They met in a very secret closed-door meeting. They discussed for 4 hours how to run government. And out of those 4 hours, apart from 10 minutes, the rest was how to get rid of Saddam. They spent long hours committed to removing Saddam. So the decision was there. The cause is not important. We were lucky. We were very lucky. That was fortuitous for us. Okay. This was just to say that the name of the game has not changed in the mind of the decision makers in Washington and in London. But this has to change. People have to listen, and we can actually talk and let them listen too. My worry is about the future. Now we're still upbeat about what has been achieved for the Kurds in Iraq and elsewhere, that we are close allies of the West. And even the Arab countries are accusing us of being puppets of the West. But I'm more worried than ever before, because history can repeat itself. Something that many of you, or all of you, will know. That the British came to Iraq in the early part of last century, and they called themselves, these words are simply for you to recognize when Rumsfeld talks about Iraqi freedom. The British came to Iraq as liberators, not as occupiers, just like America is in Iraq as liberator, not occupier. When the king was inaugurated, they held a referendum, and they did make sure that the referendum will be successful. They put the king there and surrounded by officers, British officers, to make sure that that will stand. And in the process, any Kurd or Arab revolted against the king had no way of suppressing them. So the British army went and suppressed the Kurds and the Arabs. Just think of the scenario in Iraq now, where if it is bad for the Americans, if the Kurds wanted Kirkuk, who would then be helping the Iraqi central government to suppress the Kurds? You asked the question about Churchill. Man of the century, last century, the greatest Brit of all times. He actually described us as uncivilized tribes. These are his words. Okay? The MP, Bob, actually responded to you as, he said, let's focus on the future, not the past. Can you ask Shahor or Alan, Wahid or Kocha to forget the past? Alan lost his father. He was brought up without a father. And how many more are in Halabja without parents whose lives could have been different, could have been better? We are here because of Saddam. How can you forget? And if you forget, what is your cause? What is your case? What's your moral case? to actually win further support in the future. I think focusing on the future meaning learning from the past and using it. British policy towards the Kurds has always been inadequate. It was the Brits who drew the borders, we all know. They suppressed the Kurds for the Iraqis. And then what happened at the end? And that's my fear about the Americans. They left the Kurds in 1958 in the hand of the most brutal Arab fundamentalist regimes to perpetrate things like Anfal and Halabja. It was the British that left the Kurds in the hand of Arab nationals, now in this mess, and suddenly abandoned them. When everybody now in the streets of Baghdad, Basra and elsewhere say this Kurdish veto will not stand, imagine what can happen if we ask for Kirkuk and oil and having our own army and everything else. This is my worry for the future. At the moment, luckily we have an influence there. We have veto whether we like it or not. But it is this tank that I'm afraid of. And it's the Kurds in the middle being squeezed out. Remember what happened in Iran. Everybody, including the communists, hailed Khomeini when he went back to Iran. Within a couple of years, there was no one to be seen in the picture, other than the clergy. And that same clergy have been supporting a lot of clergies in Iraq. The mentality will not change overnight. I know a lot of them were in Britain, but even in Britain, did they actually look at democracy in Britain? Did they know how Britain is run? Did they actually integrate in the society of Britain? Did they actually introduce democracy in their own homes? Did they treat their wives and children in the same democratic ways that they are now trying to establish in Iraq? These are my worries. It's not dismissing them. It's to remain vigilant about it all. Britain has never been interested in minorities, has never been interested in the Kurds. They should now rethink that whole policy. We need the British establishment to have a clear policy about the Kurds, to have a clear vision. They still have not come out. They still consider what they drew in 1920s as sacred, integrity of Iraqi soil. Of course we want integrity of Iraqi soil if we are free and first-class citizens. We should ask the British establishment, not just Tony Blair, to clarify their vision and their policy. We do not want Tony Blair and others to describe in waffly speeches what is the British long-term vision. Buried in the middle of that, their intention of actually again denying us. Remember the Foreign Office in Britain, and I know that, is full of pro-Arab countries and pro-Arab lobbyists. There are people who are, the most pro-Arab foreign department in the whole of Europe is in Britain. When it comes to Kurdish issue, there is no one to listen. The person who is in charge of Iraqi desk does not believe in Kurdish rights. And it's that person whom we should really change, not Tony Blair. Tony Blair is here today and gone tomorrow. But those experts, advisors, are there forever. They advise the government, and they will stop Tony Blair if he does anything that goes outside that policy. So, I think they owe us in Iraq. I think they owe us elsewhere. I'm almost there. Okay. I expected that. Remember, we received them with flowers. We actually sacrificed our men and women. We helped them along. And they should really support our veto inside the Iraqi Council. And importantly, Turkey, no matter what it does, Turkey was not there at the time of need, didn't help Americans and British. Why should they have a bigger say now than we have? We should have a bigger say in this swing of power. I want to finish very, very briefly with the last few things that some of you may not know. Who actually built Iraqi chemical weapons? The companies. Who should be held responsible for the homeless, for the deportation, for the death of our children, and the loss of the future? Look at this man. Where is he now? And also the environment that Robert talked about. We have lost so much, immeasurable. Okay. I actually examined soil from Halabja, and others did, and there are still traces in bombs and in paints in houses. Who actually participated in this? The countries of the Gulf paid for this, and a lot of countries of the West actually built the weapons, the programs, and supplied various elements of that program to Iraq. Who should we hold accountable? Do we know them? The United Nations asked Iraq to produce a dossier. They went to the... I wanted to remind you one thing, helping Iraq during the war was illegal under United Nations mandate. United Nations actually had a clear rule that it was illegal to support either side. Now this journal actually published names that the Security Council didn't want to publish. I want to remind you that the dossier was presented to the United Nations, and the 5 members of the Security Council decided to conceal all the information in the name that they don't want further proliferation of these weapons, but I know what they were after. They wanted to protect their own back. 80 companies in Germany were actually participants in that. And remember, I don't know if any of you know, Helmut Kohl went in the late 80s, and I remember that very well, went to Israel and donated tens of billions of marks as compensation for the Second War victims of Auschwitz and elsewhere. 40 years later, now we have influence. We can actually harm the interest of the West and East in Iraq if they don't actually show us goodwill. We can do as much as they did. And here is USA, lots and lots of companies, and Bechtel. I don't have time to explain to you what all these letters I've put against these names for, but US department, various governmental departments are also responsible. The list in France is actually far greater than this, but I've just shown you a few. And British companies, some of them are fake companies, lots and lots of them, we know them by name, but I can remind you that the information revealed was actually completely inadequate. Only a small proportion of the names were released or were taken. Which country is actually safe? Russia still continued until the last day to support Iraq, as well as Japan. We mentioned about the trees that went to Halabja. We mentioned about Japan trying to help, and China, of course, and all these Cs being chemical weapons, actually, programs. Sweden, Netherlands, Spain, and Belgium, you name it. Okay? I've mentioned that already. My last slide is, I'm very sorry about this. I'll leave you with my conclusions. The slide on it, and I'm not going to say anymore, but thank you very much for being good.
Our next guest speaker is Sami Ramadani.